Imagine finishing a long week of work with no Netflix, no social media, no phone in your pocket. What would you actually do with your time? For most of us, that sounds unbearable, but for a Roman citizen living in 100 AD, free time wasn't a problem. It was a way of life, and the way they used it tells us something profound about what humans actually need to feel alive. The Roman workday was short by modern standards. Most citizens, artisans, merchants, minor officials, finished their work by early afternoon. That left a large block of daily time that Romans treated almost as a second life. They had a word for it: odium. It didn't mean laziness, it meant deliberate rest, social engagement, and the kind of reflection that made a person more fully human. In today's video, we're going to walk through exactly how an ordinary Roman spent those hours, and why their approach was surprisingly sophisticated. The first stop for almost any Roman was the thermae, the public baths, but calling them baths dramatically undersells what they were. The baths of Caracalla, completed in 216 AD, could hold 1,600 people at once. They contained a library, exercise yards, shops, gardens, and yes, a series of heated pools. Romans didn't go to bathe and leave. They went to spend 2 or 3 hours of their afternoon. They exercised, debated politics, struck business deals, read poetry aloud, and ate food sold by vendors who worked the changing rooms. The baths were Rome's version of a community center, gym, and cafe, all in one building. An entry cost 1 quadrans, the smallest coin in Roman currency, roughly equivalent to the price of a bread roll. But the baths weren't just a physical experience, they were a social equalizer. A senator and a freedman could sit in the same pool. A merchant and a philosopher could share a bench in the exercise yard. This happened almost nowhere else in Roman society, where status dictated every interaction. The baths dissolved those boundaries for a few hours each day, and Romans took full advantage. Friendships formed there. Business partnerships were sealed there. Political alliances were quietly built in the steam. The Roman writer Pliny the Younger described the sounds of the baths in a letter: the grunting of men exercising, the splashing of swimmers, the calls of food vendors, the occasional shout of an argument. And he wasn't complaining. He was painting a picture of civilization fully alive. On certain days, especially festival days, free time meant spectacle. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 to 80,000 spectators, and entry was free, subsidized by the state or wealthy sponsors. Chariot races at the Circus Maximus drew even larger crowds. Some estimates put capacity at 250,000, roughly a quarter of Rome's entire population. These weren't just entertainment, they were deeply social events. People attended with their neighborhoods, their professional guilds, their political factions. Historians like Fick Mayer have noted that the games served as one of the few occasions when ordinary Romans and the emperor appeared in the same space, creating a strange kind of shared civic ritual. You cheered together, you grieved together, you saw who the emperor was watching, and the emperor saw who was watching him. The chariot races in particular gripped Roman society at every level. There were 4 racing factions: the blues, greens, reds, and whites, and Romans supported them with a loyalty that puts modern sports fandom to shame. People bet their savings on races. Riots broke out when results were disputed. One charioteer named Gaius Appuleius Diocles raced for 24 years and won 1,462 out of 4,257 races. His career earnings, converted to modern estimates, have been calculated at roughly $15 billion, making him arguably the highest paid athlete in human history. Romans didn't just watch sport, they were consumed by it. Not every Roman wanted noise and crowds. The city was also dotted with public gardens, horti, that were originally private aristocratic estates, gradually opened to citizens. Romans walked. They walked seriously, as a leisure activity in itself. The philosopher Cicero famously did his best thinking while pacing the covered walkways called porticos. Walking was also the setting for the peripatetic conversation, long, wandering discussions about philosophy, law, and the nature of the good life. These weren't casual chats. Romans considered a person's conversational ability a mark of character. A man who could argue well, tell stories, quote poets, and listen generously was considered civilized. A man who could not was considered barely better than a laborer. regardless of his wealth. Romans also read. More than many people realize, Rome had public libraries. At its peak, the city had 29 of them, free and open to citizens. Reading was a communal activity, not a solitary one. Romans typically read aloud, even when alone, because silent reading was considered unusual. In the evening, households with any means would employ a lector, a trained slave whose sole job was to read aloud at dinner, during baths, and while the household went about its business. The wealthy essentially lived inside a continuous narration of history, philosophy, and poetry. Books circulated through friend networks, were copied by scribes, and discussed at dinner parties with the same energy modern people bring to television. Speaking of dinner, as the sun set, the cena, the evening meal, began. For wealthy Romans, dinner wasn't eating, it was theater. Guests reclined on couches, were attended by slaves, and moved through multiple courses over several hours. But even among ordinary Romans, the evening meal was the emotional center of the day. It was when family gathered, when neighbors were invited, when wine was measured and poured in careful proportions. Romans typically diluted wine 3 parts water to 1 part wine, and a person who drank undiluted was considered dangerously uncivilized. The dinner also featured entertainment, the lector reading aloud from poetry or history, musicians, and sometimes small theatrical performances. The meal was the place where Roman social life was most fully expressed, and after dinner, Romans gambled. This is the part historians sometimes gloss over, but the Romans were obsessed with games of chance. Dice games were played everywhere, in taverns, in private homes, even scratched into the steps of public buildings. The Emperor Augustus was a famously enthusiastic dice player and didn't bother pretending otherwise. Tesserae, 3 dice thrown together, was the game of choice. Gambling was technically illegal in Rome except during the festival of Saturnalia in December, but the law was almost universally ignored. Street corner dice games were as common as street food. The fine for being caught was typically 4 times the amount wagered, which most people considered a reasonable price for an evening's entertainment. Here's what strikes me about all of this. The Romans had extraordinary wealth and architectural ambition, and they used it almost entirely to create spaces for people to be together in unhurried ways. The baths, the gardens, the libraries, the racetracks, the dinner table. Every single one of these was designed around the same core idea that a human being needs time with other humans, without any particular purpose, in order to remain fully human. The Roman philosopher Seneca wrote that you cannot find a person who is willing to share their money, but everyone is willing to share their time, and yet time is the only thing worth more than money. He was writing that in 60 AD. 2,000 years later, the research in social psychology says almost exactly the same thing. Loneliness is now one of the leading predictors of early death. The Harvard study of adult development, one of the longest studies of human life ever conducted, found that the quality of a person's relationships is the single strongest predictor of how long and how happily they live. And the Romans built an entire civilization around solving that problem before it started. What we can take from the Romans isn't nostalgia. It's a question worth asking seriously. When you finish your work today, what do you do with the hours that remain? The Romans answered that question with extraordinary intentionality. They built architecture around it, wrote philosophy about it, and organized their entire cities to make it as easy as possible. We've done something close to the opposite. We filled every gap in the day with content, notifications, and tasks. The average person now spends over 7 hours a day looking at screens. The Romans would have found that incomprehensible, not because they lacked stimulation. The Colosseum held 80,000 people, but because their stimulation required them to be physically present with other human beings. You couldn't watch the chariot races alone in your room. You couldn't enjoy the baths by yourself. Even reading was a shared, spoken activity. Every form of Roman leisure was designed to pull people together rather than push them into isolation. Maybe the most radical thing a modern person can do is take their otium seriously. There is one more thing worth saying before we close. The Romans didn't stumble into this way of living by accident. It was a deliberate cultural choice, debated by their philosophers, encoded in their architecture, and enforced by their social norms. Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Cicero, they all wrote extensively about the danger of filling your hours with meaningless busyness. They called it negotium, the opposite of odium, and they considered a life dominated by it to be a wasted one. This wasn't fringe thinking. It was the mainstream Roman view of what a good human life looked like. Compare that to today, where busyness is worn as a badge of honor, where saying you're busy implies importance, productivity, success. The Romans would have looked at that attitude with genuine pity. To them, a person who had no time to walk, think, converse, or sit at a long dinner with people they loved was not successful. They were poor in the only way that mattered. They had traded the substance of life for its appearance. We know all of this from the historical record, from the letters of Pliny, the essays of Seneca, the histories of Livy, the satirical poems of Juvenal, who complained about Rome's noise and chaos the way people complain about cities today. These weren't abstract thinkers. They were people living inside this civilization, noticing what worked and what didn't, and writing it down with extraordinary honesty. They are, in a real sense, still talking to us. The question is whether we're listening. The Romans also had something we rarely talk about when discussing ancient civilizations: a genuine culture of play. Not just for children, for everyone. Board games like Ludus Latrunculorum, a strategy game similar to chess, were played in homes, taverns, and military camps across the empire. Knucklebones, a game of throwing and catching small bones or stones, was played by adults and children alike in the streets. Evidence of game boards has been found scratched into the floors of the Colosseum, into Roman forts along Hadrian's Wall in Britain, and into the paving stones of cities from North Africa to modern-day Turkey. Wherever Romans went, they brought their games. Play was not a childhood phase they outgrew. It was a permanent feature of Roman adult life, treated as essential rather than frivolous. And underneath all of it, the baths, the races, the gardens, the dinner parties, the dice games, the board games, was a consistent philosophy about what time was actually for. The Romans believed that leisure, used well, made you more human. That rest wasn't the absence of work, but the presence of something richer. That the hours you spent doing nothing in particular with people you cared about were not wasted hours. They were, in fact, the point. The work existed to fund the life. The life was not supposed to become the work.